Welcome to Faster Websites Equals More Revenue. We're just going to go through the agenda very quickly here. Move through to the next slide. Okay, so thanks for joining us. Obviously, this webinar is all about the online retail, and it's based around a study we've done for the past few months, since January really, monitoring all the top 20 retail sites and seeing what sort of patterns have emerged, what sort of the best practices that are being followed or not, as the case may be, in terms of website performance, maximizing revenue, and all those sorts of things that we can derive from external monitoring. In a second, I'll pass you across to my colleague Larry Haig, who's a senior consultant here at Intechnica, who conducted much of the study, and he'll go through all sorts of the results, any gotchas that we noticed, and all suggestions that we can make.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. As Alex said, please raise your hands if you can't hear me or you have any communication problems. So, welcome to the webinar. That's me. I'm not going to dwell on that. Suffice it to say that I've been hanging on to the coattails of developments in the web since the late 90s, and certainly a lot of things have flowed under the bridge in that time. This most recent study commenced in January. It is an ongoing study, and these are some preliminary findings, essentially. So let's start with the findings, I think, and then show you the pretty graphs after that. Well, the first is that performance is not related to platform. It's not as simple as putting a silver bullet in place and moving to whatever the latest and greatest platform that you favour is. It's more fundamental than that. So performance by design applies. It applies even more forcefully if your platform is perhaps, or your infrastructure isn't quite up to it, but nevertheless that stands above the core technologies. Second thing is, we've got some major e-commerce sites in the frame here. There is little consistency. Some seem to embrace performance quite strongly, and we can see that, and we will see that in the consistency of the performance they deliver. Some people have got patchy performance, which clearly can happen to anybody, and some really don't seem to bother about performance at all, and that is a high-risk strategy, as we'll aim to show you. We captured and do continue to capture an awful lot of data, and it's not practical to bombard you with all the findings, but what we wanted to do was break this down, and for this initial webinar we want to focus particularly on the third-party affiliate load within the sites and some approaches to that have been adopted by the panelists. In terms of making best use of or delivering best performance for a given affiliate load, there are and have been in recent years a very large number of tag managers that have been tag management solutions that have been developed. We looked at the predominance of those in this panel, and it's apparent that a very few larger vendors in that space are starting to shake themselves out, but penetration is still relatively limited. It's still an emergent thing. How well the tag management systems offer a number of advantages, not just performance, but as far as performance is concerned, we tried to look at how well they were doing in that area, and some interesting results there, I think. And then finally, we looked at some quality of service issues, but also at some base object analysis, which is a lightweight way of seeing what the fundamentals of the site look like, and some interesting examples there which cover a fairly broad waterfront that show that you can be a major player, but that doesn't mean that necessarily you're not going to get problems. We've talked about that. So let's move on. So what is good performance? Why should we bother about performance? Just a couple of slides. I feel I've been delivering these slides for 10 years, and to some extent I have, but just in brief then, it is well accepted now that performance is one of the major influencers on customer behaviour. It's not the only one, but it's certainly quite major. This Nielsen slide is fairly old, but still stands up well and gives you a sense of the sort of targets you should be aiming for if you want to maximise customer behaviour in this regard. Just to show you how badly it can go wrong, this is a major pure play retailer. It's looking at end-user PC-based site testing from Russia using Opera browsers, and as you'll probably be aware, Opera is head and shoulders the most popular browser in that geography. And this is quite a useful way of looking at things, and we will look at this again when we look at the base object analysis. This is cumulative average component splits, in this case not just for the base object but for the entire page. And you can see, I mean, there's various things that can be drawn out of this, but one of them is the huge amount of white space between the green line, which is the infrastructure, the first byte time, and the total delivery time. And that is occupied, that is client-side processing time. So that very much repays effort in that regard, and it's interesting in that that was particularly bad, but when we looked at other global locations, the situation was nowhere near as marked. So what affects your conversion rate, your revenue? Well, lots of things is the bottom line. Some are what you might call retail factors. So what are you selling? How are you presenting them to the customers? What is the overall appearance of the site, the gravity factors there? And clearly that has an influence on performance, because if you've got a lot of multimedia, a lot of big images, then the site might look attractive for those that can see it, but you might have to wait around a long time for them to appear. So it's a question of walking that tightrope. Some specific retail things that have major impacts are things like free shipping, including, nothing's free in this world, but including free shipping in your shopping cart has major digit impacts on conversion rate typically, as do certain payment options in certain markets. Credit offers in Germany spring to mind, but there are many. And then all the technical factors that influence performance, and again, there is many and varied as your infrastructure and the architecture you use. Some are third parties, payment service providers, and some are more local to you, but either way, suffice it to say this is a non-trivial area. Lots of things can step up and push you off the straight and narrow, and that's even more likely to happen at times of high demand, which makes the revenue impact so much the greater. So what you get to, and this is quite old data, this is one of the major vendors, and it's 2011, but it stands up absolutely, which I don't make any apologies for using it. The thing to say is twofold. A, performance, although it's only one of the things, is one of the major impacts on conversion and abandonment, and also the nature of the decay curve of this type will be unique to your particular site. So this is really making a generic point, which is using aggregate data from US retailers, but it is important, if you don't already have one, we would strongly counsel you to create one. And we can talk to us afterwards, we can talk to you about how to go about that, but if you have your own unique curve of this type, you will be able to monetize effects. You will know for your site how much money it's costing you per 500 milliseconds of delay in load time, or whatever it may be. So let's just park that and take that as a given, that performance matters. And let's move on to some of the underlying factors around performance. I mentioned performance by design. That's a sort of catch-all term that we use at Intechnica to talk to the various things that are applied either front end or back end to enhance and optimize performance. We do have a tool, and any of you that have heard any of my previous presentations will probably have heard me allude to it, the Intechnica Performance Index. Now this is an algorithm which we designed and developed using real-world data basically what it is a multiple correlation, a weighted correlation algorithm that is applied to certain standard metrics that we measure using external monitoring and then apply to performance. And what this enables you to do is essentially get an understanding of the underlying performance potential of your site, how well it could perform. So some sites are slow and some are quick. The slow ones, there might be lots of things going on. There could be one small factor that is impeding their performance, which if resolved led to a major improvement in performance. Some others have got lots of underlying issues, and although you can nearly always improve performance, how economic that is, will vary. So, in simple terms, you sometimes have to throw more money at the problem to make a fast site, a slow site fast. So this is trying to give some insight into this. So this is the matrix. The idea is we measure the IPI and we measure the end user performance to PCs in standard conditions. And this is a real life example. Here's a site that was scoring 9.6. The IPI can range between almost 0 and it's not capped at the top end. I've seen values of more than 150, but typically 0 to 100, but it's not normalized in that range. So a value of less than 10 is good. You would expect high performance. This particular retailer was showing particularly low performance. That's a good situation because if they've got such a low IPI, the fundamentals are in place. It's simply a question of finding out what is eating up the time, which we did in working with them, and lo and behold, the site improved and became one of the top 3-4 players in the standard benchmarks. So that's what we're seeking to achieve. Let's have a look at platforms. I mentioned platforms in the findings, and we were intrigued really to understand the influence of platforms, because it might have been as simple as saying queue up and give all your money to IBM or Demandware or whoever and all your problems will be over. Unfortunately, life's not that simple. When we did the IPI analysis for the various different sites and then overlaid the platforms, we found this. And this is sort of top 20 retailers plus. This is actually the top 50. We've expanded it somewhat, but it includes all the top 20 ones. So there we see it. So clearly there's a lot of WebSphere out there, but also equally clearly that represents both one of the fastest sites and one of the slowest and everything in between. If you look at the other platforms, a similar pattern. Some have got far fewer. I mean, if you look at Hybris, there are only 2 or 3 examples, and they're all in the star performer range. So that could be a candidate for saying, there's our silver bullet. However, if we then expanded it and looked, rather than looking at the retail sites particularly, looked at the users of those particular platforms and how they stacked up, well, you see a different picture. And what you've got there is the good, the bad and the ugly for all the sites. And it really just makes our point that these are large frameworks and platforms which should give you advantage, but they won't do so automatically. They will confer a lot of potential advantage in terms of scale and so on, but they typically don't limit things. If you decide to put a 10 meg homepage up there, you're going to take a caning. And so that's worth bearing in mind. And that's really the moral of that story, that you may have, if you've got a particular platform, you may have a sleek race horse, or you might have a Shetland pony, worth finding out and applying those core principles to convert to be on the left-hand side of the entry when the Grand National comes along. So let's get to the top 20 study. As I say, it's ongoing, very much ongoing. What the participants are as shown, they are not necessarily the largest 20, but they're all within the top 50. We made some modifications to ensure that we could compare an approximately similar transaction. So what we're comparing here is not landing page performance, but revenue-bearing transaction performance, in particularly search and add to basket transaction. This is what we were seeking to do in general, and what we do seek to do, to look at any trends that are emergent, both at detailed level and just in terms of performance, to understand the vendors underpinning those performance, the technologies that are being used, and to progressively seek to tease out any of the panelists that are having problems from time to time and understand why that might be, and see if there's any general learning in terms of best practice development. So what have we got? Let's start with some of the trends. Not a terribly exciting chart, I would give you that. So here we're comparing a smartphone, and we use the Galaxy S4 and have continued to do so. Still quite a large user base, despite the fact it's not nowhere near the most recent now. PC-based end users, and also as a reference, ISP-based testing. So this is looking at clean room test conditions against the PC sites. And you can see the radical difference there. In broad terms, from an end user in common connectivity conditions, which is important, of 1 megabit per second, then the PC sites are slower overall. There did seem to be a rising trend, but when we looked at that, it was associated with one particular panelist that was having some problems. When we look at the ISP-based performance, you can see that's fairly flat. That's the lower arrow. It was, as is often the case, an issue which was exacerbated in end-user conditions. So limiting bandwidth and end-user PC testing was causing that problem, which in this case was so severe that it was skewing the whole panel. But in general terms, that's the learning there. If we look in a bit more detail, and what we've done here, just really to aid interpretation, is just to rag it. So fairly arbitrarily, anything delivering, any individual page delivering in less than 5 seconds, that's total load time, not browser fill time, is green, 5 to 10 seconds amber, and more than 10 seconds, which is well up the top of those Nielsen figures you saw earlier, is red. So what can we learn from that? Well, there's a large range. There isn't, despite the fact these are large and successful companies, the performance of their sites varies quite dramatically. In general terms, the performance of the smartphones tends to be better than the tablet and PC devices. I think two different things probably acting there. PC sites are sometimes older, they are often larger. There is a perception that you can do what you like with the PC because it can cope with it. Well, that is not really borne out by the evidence. Tablets, they vary, but the same principles apply. There's less system performance to play with, so it's just important to keep a grip on that when you're looking at your responsive design and so on. So I didn't want to dwell in that too much, but there we are. That's a split across this revenue-bearing transaction by page for the different devices. Just in terms of getting some more learning out of that, I then ranked each of them by page, by sequence in the transaction. So you can see sequence 0 is the landing page, and then typically search, select product, add to basket, and so on. Some have more steps. A couple of sites have additional steps, which are typically select country type thing. And then each of them, each page, I ranked. So the overall ranking is by transaction performance, from 8 seconds to something over 23 seconds. And then they're split, they're numbered 1 to 10 in each case. And I've just highlighted the fastest and the slowest in each case. And you can see that if you look at this site, which is a fashion retailer, global, very successful in performance these days, wasn't always the case, but in recent years they certainly have been. And you can see that right across the piece, and when we look in detail at other factors, they come up smelling of roses. They have clearly a management focus on performance per se. If you look down the bottom here, well, this site I suppose could be argued that they absolutely don't. They're probably just not bothered about performance. They don't perceive it as being important. That could be costing them a lot of money. Some other sites, they vary. I mean, the bottom one of all are let down by a couple of steps. So what we'd say there is, learn from that. Focus, given that none of us live in a world of unlimited time and money, focus your efforts where the time delays are occurring. So if you look at your key transactions, split them out, and then understand where the time is going and seek to make interventions. A 10% intervention in a step that's taking 10 seconds saves you a second. A 10% intervention where it's 100 milliseconds is negligible and nobody will notice. So if we look at the mobile, again this is the smartphone, the Galaxy S4, 3G connection, so wireless connectivity, but at 1 megabit per second, which is fairly optimized in fact. There's the range, so 4.6 seconds to 14.2. None of that is absolutely terrible. Bear in mind this is a 4-step transaction. And then you see the pattern emerging again. And to take the same suspects, and they are actually the same panel companies, the same story. So nowhere worse than third place gives you top of the tree performance there. Elsewhere, it really also ran performance right across the piece, and it does drag you down. So we just say it's worth looking at things in some detail. So let's move on now to the meat of this, which is the third-party content, so which we call affiliate content, not only us, but others do as well. And this concept of the affiliate-derived, so the third-party derived performance deficit. If you add content to your site from whatever source, you are adding additional round-trip connections, you are adding weight to the site, and you're adding processing, and you would expect that to have an impact on performance. It obviously will. Now, it may be a lot, it may be a little, but suffice it to say that third-party content, as I've said there, is absolutely integral to e-commerce. Interestingly, not all panelists accept that. Some use very few, but most use large numbers, as we'll see. And they're all designed to deliver revenue either directly or indirectly, often directly. So they're important. We're not saying walk away from third-party content, but we definitely would say look at it carefully, audit it, and understand the impact. And when you've got your decay curve, you'll be able to monetize that impact. And if that exceeds in any given case the revenue you're getting from it, then that's a really strong case for rationalizing the site. So if you look at the sorts of things here, everybody uses analytics by and large, one way or the other. Everybody uses advertising in its various forms. Other things vary. A/B testing, well, you wouldn't necessarily see it at any given time, so you can imagine that would be rather higher than that. But there are plenty of things. Personalization, remarketing is very big these days, of course, and so on and so on. So there's the pattern. If we then look at, what we did was analyze each of our panel sites and looked at the total number of unique vendors. So we weren't looking at the number of tags, if you like. The way these work, as you all know, is through JavaScript, injected JavaScript tags. Any given vendor might have several tags. That would skew the figures. So we were just looking at the number of vendors, and further to that, we were looking at, in this part of the study, non-performance related vendors. So we wanted to remove things like CDNs, which would, well, that's not tag-based, but that is a third party that has a definite performance effect. So that's going to skew things. So unique third-party, non-performance tags, and that's how they stack up. Everything from 1 to 50, almost 50, across those top 20. So a big spread. This is just one site, and it's just looking at a scattergram of the third-party inclusions. This is just for one page. They're just too many, really, to do the whole transaction. But suffice it to say that performance varies. Now, as you'll know, most of these sites, nearly all of them these days, are asynchronous, so they are non-blocking in that regard. However, they do introduce stress on the infrastructure, and you can get, I mean, there are definitely lots of negatives, which I won't go into now for the shortness of time, in having slow-performing tags, whether they're async or not. And there you see quite a range. And some quite interesting things there, if we wanted to spend some time on it, the banding and so on, probably reflecting load balancing issues at the third party, in fact. But anyway, so there's a lot there. And we'd say, somewhat flippantly, but not really flippantly, is your journey necessary? Do you really need those round trip times? Do you want to carry that performance overhead? And that's where audits come in. And suffice it to say that any given individual third party doesn't necessarily have consistent performance. It's even more indicative when you bear in mind that these vendors have got to support the aggregate traffic for the whole of the retail industry, not just the traffic coming to your site, which at times like Christmas, at peak times, becomes a colossal management issue. Let's look at a specific site, and here we've got a breakdown. It's the same transaction and split into all the various different things. In this particular case, I did include CDNs, but just gives you an idea of the range. And here we have identical tests. So this is search and add to basket tests running clean room conditions. So if you like, perfect external conditions, not end user test conditions. One of those scripts has got the third parties filtered out, and one is just standard. And you can see there's a fairly chunky gap between the two, something of the order of 50% of the total transaction time. That's a fairly academic figure though, 2.32 seconds, who cares about that? But it's not the real world. It's good, consistent test data, but if you extrapolate that to the end user, you're talking about something like 7 seconds across that transaction. Very highly likely to have an impact. It will definitely have an impact on revenue. The question then becomes, how much are you getting against that through remarketing, etc., to offset that? And really what we'd say is test it, find out for yourselves. So what interventions are possible? Well, there are lots. You can do it yourself, or you can use tag managers. And as I say, there's a plethora of those. The market is going in through some kind of convergence at the moment. They're all busy buying one another. I could talk to you about that, but we're not really here to talk about tag management in that regard. There's how they split. I put down the bottom there, you see BrightTag stroke Site Tagger. That was an acquisition of BrightTag. Well, no sooner did I finish this presentation, but BrightTag reinvented themselves as Signal, just to spite me. So BrightTag reads Signal. You've got Google Tag Manager, DC Swarms, Qubit, Telium, and then the biggest of all, 50% basically, use nothing at all. Now, how relevant that might be, we'll see in a moment. So if we look at the split, and we looked at the content load just now, this is the same graph, but it's color-coded by those that use tag managers. And you can see that the grey, which is none being used, there's definitely increased preponderance as you move towards the left. So those with less tags have less propensity to use tag management, which is not a surprise, and that could be absolutely valid in a lot of those cases. When you move towards the right-hand side, well, there's some bold decisions there. If you look at the two that have the most, the largest affiliate load, one of those sites is using a tag manager, the other absolutely isn't. That could be regarded as a courageous decision. And there are certainly numerous advantages from tag management, not only performance, and gaining something, one would assume that some advantage would be gained if you've got a very heavy load. If we look at the performance if we look at the usage, if you like, of TMS by performance, so by this concept of the performance deficit, as we saw earlier, so this is the amount by which your affiliate content is dragging you back. Again, quite a range there. and we can see a range of TMS usage as we go up there. There's not an absolutely clear position there. I was intrigued to try and get a handle on how well a given tag management system was working for these sites. Not an easy thing to do externally. If you have a tag management system, clearly you can compare the performance with and without it and that sort of thing. I wasn't in a position to be able to do that. So what I did instead was, first of all, just plot the amount of affiliates against the performance deficit. As you might imagine, you get a fairly linear increase, that the heavier the load, the more it's going to drag you back. No real surprises there. I then color-coded the points by the tag management system employed. And if you think about it, what we're looking to the TMS to do, in this regard anyway, as far as performance is concerned, is to create a left shift. So for a given affiliate, to pull it down so that the impact, the performance impact is less. And you see quite a range there actually. You see, and often the same vendors are on both sides of the line. And what this is essentially saying is that the situation isn't quite as simple as that. So it's not that simple to measure to start with, and then it's confounded by, well, a few things, but one of the principal ones is this concept of fourth generation tags, or daisy chaining sometimes called, where tags that are introduced then pull other tags in and bypass the TMS. Now if that's happening, that's not the fault of the TMS, if you like, but it's something that's worth being aware of. The take-home message really is, for your given site, we would strongly counsel you to do an audit, find out what you've got in there. That can be quite instructive. There can be quite a lot of stuff that's been put in as a favour by IT years ago and still sits there whirring away, in spite of the fact this stuff is superseded. You see all sorts of things. But understanding that, measuring the performance deficit, if you're using a TMS, satisfying yourself that you're getting good value there as well. So let's dive into, change tack slightly here and look at some detailed component analysis. As slightly tongue-in-cheek, as they say, retail is detail, well, so is performance analysis. If we look at this, this was looking at the panel companies, and we split them out by a number of front-end factors. So the number, and many of these are known to affect performance. So the number of connections, the number of images, the payload as far as images is concerned, the total weight of images, the size of the largest image, and then things which one would expect to have somewhat less effect, the size of the text and the JavaScript or JSON content of the site. And again, just to aid interpretation, I've coloured the bottom 20% in any category red. So you can see the extent to which given factors affect performance in general. And it's clear that payload, I mean this isn't news, but it's clear that payload has an effect. But the interesting, probably the most effect, the interesting thing to me though is some of the individual figures that we're seeing here. A site with a 2.5 megabyte image. And this is excluding multimedia, by the way. There wasn't much multimedia, but there was some, but I excluded it from analysis in it. Anybody with 2.5 meg, with a 2.5 meg image in one of their major revenue-bearing transactions is going to be looking down the barrel of problems, and you can see that these guys absolutely have those problems. This is ranked by the performance. Total payload of 5 meg, so half their payload. Surely that's not a conscious decision, far more likely to be a control thing, governance, it slipped through the net, somebody was under pressure, they uploaded a site, an image that wasn't optimized, that was perhaps an inappropriate format, whatever, but worth looking out for these things, because all the good work that those guys were spending on everything else really could be undone by one error. All humans are fallible, but if you've got the control systems in place, you can screen some of that out. A lot of variation in connections. It was quite interesting that some of the people with the largest connections got away with it, but that's perhaps another story. But really, again, not a difficult analysis to do with the appropriate tooling. I would say well worth doing for yourselves, because that could really throw a searchlight on some low-hanging fruit that you could easily resolve and that would make major differences to the revenue flows. So if we look at skipping on, because I'm conscious of time, let's just look at some what I've called gotchas. So here we have, as we've said before, the top 20 retailers, or within the top 50 retailers anyway. Looking at some component analysis, we looked at component analysis a little earlier, but this was simply looking at the base object, so we're not looking at all the rest of the content in the page. That sort of thing isn't comprehensive, but what it can do is give you an understanding of some of the underlying things that are going on in terms of delivery of that site before you look at third-party load and all the rest of it. And yeah, a few little interesting snapshots. So what we've done is we've split it out, and it's color-coded, as you'll see, by total response time, DNS time, connection, first byte time, and content delivery time. And there we see one. So this is a panelist who are always fairly low in the rankings, actually, it must be said. I won't tell you who they are, or what they do, but they are retailers, high street retailers, with a fairly large presence on the web. And you can see that the performance is relatively slow, but the green line, which is the first byte time, is always implicated. So infrastructure insufficiency is really what you can take home from here. For whatever reason, and you'd need to look at the appropriate infrastructure tooling to get a handle on it, that is what is letting these guys down. But the interesting thing perhaps is that the area that I've highlighted in red, that was the Easter weekend. And you can clearly see that the demand, the increase in traffic over Easter, has had an even more deleterious effect on them, and it really did pull things down quite dramatically. So that's one thing. Moving on to another one. So this is a site that's higher up the rankings, and you can see here they've got some spiky response, and in this case it's associated with the purple line. It's associated with inconsistent delivery of their content. Now, I don't know how they're dealing with content. I didn't spend the time to find out, but whatever it is, smoothing that out would be beneficial to them. Bear in mind, this isn't RUM data. This is not visitor data. This is external so-called active test data. So these are the slow responses from that particular test. You can multiply that by all the customers at that time slice that were being affected, so perhaps even more effective. And then finally, this site is the best of the lot. We've already looked at them, and they've got a tremendously high performance site. But I included this really just to show that however good you are, complacency is misplaced. So when we looked at the scattergram, we saw that although the average performance was great, there was quite a range there, and there were some quite long, disconcertingly long times going on there, 750 milliseconds. Bear in mind that isn't the page time, that's just the base object. When we analysed it, lo and behold, there we have it. It's almost consistently, it's DNS lookup time. So something's compromising the effective delivery of their DNS. And again, that would almost certainly be a third party, they nearly always are, well worth looking at and resolving that, and then providing that high quality performance to all the users. So to conclude, let's look at quality of service in general, and it's not, performance is all very well, but it's not the be-all and end-all, even when you're using performance tools. So that's rather paradoxical perhaps, but it's important to look at proxies for the quality of service to the end user. Now that can be error messages generated. In this case, I've looked fairly simply at the payload. So that is a great proxy for what is being delivered. So here we have a tablet And you can see that there's essentially two lines, there are two things going on there. There's one delivery of, this is a home page, at about 375 KB, and then there's an awful lot going on at 50 KB or below. Well, if we look at that, it becomes apparent that the 350, 400 KB is the full page download. There's all the objects, quite a long DNS time there actually, out of interest at the top. And then that's the small pages. So it might be an error page or it might just have things missing, but either way, it is not going to generate revenue for them. So, and those small pages will typically have blindingly fast performance, so they can skew your averages, and it's worth screening them out. If we look at another example, so this is a PC example, and you can see what could be regarded as a relatively small discrepancy, 320 KB. Now this is actually drawn from a parallel study we were running with betting sites, not from retailers, but the store is there. So, so quite a small discrepancy. If you look at the 1200 KB site, it's all there. Excellent. What's the difference for the 900? You've got no multimedia content in the middle of it, which, as you see, has a dramatic effect. And there could be click-throughs there, you know, which had direct revenue effects, but even if you didn't, you've got a brand impact there, which is important to be aware of. So that's it. It's a very quick skip through what was quite a lot of data, but to summarize, before I pass back to Alex, I'd like to just sort of boil down what we think the learning, the useful learning for practitioners could be in this area. I've mentioned this several times and I will mention it again. Ensure that you've got a defined audit process and you've got governance in place. This doesn't have to be hugely over-engineered bureaucracy. It can be quite light touch, but provided everybody who's involved in the delivery of content and the management of the site is aware of what the agreed rules are for all the relevant aspects, then you're in good shape. Set yourself some KPIs for them, and then you can go ahead and manage them, and also pick up things if if a 2 meg image does sneak under the wire, you'll be able to deal with it rapidly. Manage the economics of change. Improving performance will not happen by magic, clearly, and everything in this world costs money. It will, but perhaps the trick is to minimize the amount of investment to maximize the return, and in order to do that, it's worth knowing where the time is going. And that's at a transaction level, as we saw, but it's also at an individual component level as well. And things like the IPI is a useful way that we shortcut that by getting a generalized understanding of performance by design, but it's not absolutely integral to the process. You can do it yourselves, and we've seen some of the ways you could do that. Make sure that you baseline your web property, and we would counsel doing it in both absolute terms, so that you can see right across your business demand cycle how it's stacking up, but also relative to your sector. If you have an international component to your delivery, be aware that expectations amongst customers differ quite widely across the world. There are particular challenges, for example, in delivering to Australia, which is clearly a long way away. However, the good news is that the expectations of good performance are lower in that area than they are in the US or in the UK. So to some extent you can get away with things, but at least if you monitor your key competitors in those areas, you can avoid over-investment in this as well. Some understanding of granular analysis, as I've said, and we've looked at some of those things. If you can make it as granular as you can, it doesn't have to take a lot of time, doesn't involve very high-level skills, but it can be extremely useful. Third-party content is well worthy of audit on its own, regardless of whether you have audit processes for the management of the whole site. We've talked about why. You can readily tease these out, and if you want to do the filtering, or we'll do it for you, you can look at the performance across the demand cycle of individual third parties as well as in the aggregate. And finally, include some measure of quality of service. Whether that's screen capture on error, some tooling involves, whether it's looking at payload, whether it's looking at other things, it well repays avoiding the impact on the brand that those things can involve. So with that, I'm going to pass back to my colleague Alex, who will wrap up, make you aware of another event we've got coming down the line, and I'll seek to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thanks very much, Larry, for that. I've just got a few questions just to throw your way, Larry. So, say if there's already a real user monitoring function in place in a business, what sort of value does this add, this external, if you like, active perspective? So is it complementary to the real user?
Absolutely. It is real user monitoring to an extent. From an external monitoring perspective, there are really two components. There's so-called real user monitoring, which is sometimes called end user experience monitoring and some other things. And then there's active, also known as synthetic monitoring. The value of the RUM stuff is it's all your visitors, or at least it's all the visitors that made it to the site. It doesn't have any concept of availability, which can be an important component, particularly if you're talking about areas, regions where the quality of the underlying infrastructure is not good. There are some detailed things where you need to take care about interpretation of RUM data because it is essentially inferential. If you don't see traffic, it doesn't necessarily mean that people just don't want to use the site. It might be that they've tried to use the site but have had all sorts of problems with it. So you need to be careful, but it's great at broad brushstroke understanding of performance and also of breaking it down by browser, device, and so on, and region. There are other advantages as well. One of the deficiencies is that by and large, RUM-based tooling either cannot or does not look at things at an object level. Sometimes they can, but there are big data implications for the vendors in doing that. So this is where individual object-based tracing from an active point of view is useful. So I'm sorry, I could talk behind leg of a donkey about that, but that's in essence what it is. If anybody's interested in following that up afterwards, then I'd be delighted to talk about it more.
Okay. Another thing about sort of tying the revenue to the performance. And we were talking about, based on the ISP testing, and then it's exacerbated when you're talking about real users or the end users. Mm-hmm. So what kind of figures in a year could you be looking at? Yeah.
What through? Sorry, I don't quite understand the question.
I think if I'm understanding correctly, the number of it is sort of if you have figure X as your revenue in a year, if you could go to, your marketing manager or your e-commerce manager and say, look, if we improve this, sort of, is it a significant number? Oh,
absolutely. It can be, in analysis that we've done for clients, it can be millions of pounds, literally millions of pounds. But what you need to do, it needs to be done systematically and thoroughly, otherwise it's garbage in and garbage out. So this is why I say you need to construct, or have someone construct for you, the decay curve that we saw earlier. So in other words, the impact on conversion, of performance on conversion for your particular site across your key revenue-bearing transactions. Once you have that, you can monetize the effect. You then know that one second or every 500 milliseconds will have X amount of impact on traffic, and then you're in good shape in terms of understanding and exposing that.